Hi, I'm Charlie Green.
And I'm Henry Galley.
And we are not alive.
And today, we Not Alive people are here to talk about a little thing called episodic storytelling. Why we love it and why you should too. So Charlie, what is episodic storytelling?
So, for anyone who's maybe unfamiliar with the term or gets it a bit confused, episodic storytelling is any story, usually TV show, but not strictly speaking, audio drama as well, that is told in single chunks, single self-contained stories that form a larger season or a larger, wider, overarching story arc, as opposed to a serialized story where each episode follows on from the previous one.
Yeah, I think to give some good examples, like Doctor Who, which we're going to discuss quite extensively in this,
quite extensively
is a classic,
in this one.
Yeah, is a classic example of an episodic story primarily, and something like Game of Thrones is a extremely heavily serialized, which is the case for a lot of HBO shows. So yeah, we wanted to make this video for a little while now. The two of us really love and hold a very fond place in our hearts for the episodic storytelling shows of our youths, even though it's sort of increasingly fallen out of vogue these days. We think there's a lot that can still be gleaned from them, whether you want to tell an episodic story, whether you want to tell a serialized story, or, as is increasingly often the case, whether you want to tell kind of a hybrid where it's mainly episodic, but there is a myth arc, as they call it, such as things like The X-Files or Gravity Falls. So, Charlie, to kind of start us off on this, before we get into what we think are some of the benefits of episodic storytelling and some of our tips as to how the fine folks at home can use it for their own writing, what do you think is kind of the primary reason that we're seeing less and less episodic storytelling in a lot of what people call prestige TV?
I think a lot of it comes down to, in more recent years, I say that, it's been, decades now? More than that, since sort of streaming came into fashion.
Time is a flat circle.
Time is a flat circle. We're all just spinning around. But yeah, I think definitely the advent of streaming and definitely the kind of game plan for a lot of seasons of streaming shows tends to be designed for you to binge watch them, so you're watching one after the other, getting a continuous narrative that sort of flows throughout, as opposed to when stuff was syndicated to TV more, you'd have to tune in to catch episodes when they aired. You could maybe catch up afterwards online when that became more of a thing. In case it's not clear, dear listeners, Henry and I are, without wanting to give specifics, in our late 20s. So we've grown up with kind of all of this. We've kind of seen things go from syndicated TV, broadcast TV, to streaming, and kind of everything in between. But yeah, I'd say my kind of take or my kind of contextual take would be that it's been really the streaming boom and the kind of push towards getting people to binge watch shows rather than tune into them regularly that has led to more serialization over episodic stories.
I think you're completely right, Charlie, that this binge model that we've seen with the increasing popularity of streaming services, Netflix first, and then the approximately 50,000 other ones.
Ones I've never even heard of.
Exactly. It's all about kind of keeping asses in seats for as long as possible. They seriously de-emphasize ever making a single episode feel like a satisfying and complete storytelling experience. Yeah, it's honestly intended to be a little bit more like Pringles, that feeling of it tastes good, but it's not filling, so you'll just have one more.
Just a few more wouldn't hurt. Just a few more. Just sit down, streaming on Plubis, and just watch another episode.
Yeah, and before you know it, you are sitting there 2 hours later with a long sort of freakish giraffe-like tongue, licking crumbs out of the bottom of the Pringles tin, and wondering where your life went so wrong.
It's not the only thing my freakish giraffe tongue can do, Henry, but let's not get off topic.
Oh, behave. But anyway, it's one of those things where it's interesting, because I think while this has very much shaped audience expectations, we're also beginning to see a kind of backlash against it as well. Like, I think more and more we've seen this desire for people to return to like proper length seasons compared to the like
Mm.
Amazon is particularly bad for this. The whole like, yep, 8 episode season, and we'll take a break between the first chunk of four and the last chunk of four, which is kind of like cutting cocaine with chalk.
Yeah, or a full season will drop, or like they'll stagger the release of it and whatever, and it takes maybe 6 to 8 weeks, and then there's a upwards of a year to 2 years wait for the next season. You know, the example I'm thinking of immediately straight out of the gate is something like The Boys. Not going to get into the nitty gritty of that show. It's a whole other can of worms, but it's one where there are huge breaks between seasons coming out, and it's like it's difficult to retain interest or retain like almost just recollection of like events of like when you're doing a serialized story that spans multiple seasons, and where stuff that, you know, potentially like was mentioned in earlier stories or earlier parts of that story are gonna have some kind of impact or some kind of payoff later in the season, or later in the series rather. It can be hard to like, if there's been like a 2-year gap between the last portion of the story that was released, you know, unless you are the kind of person who you know, kind of religiously rewatches stuff just before the release of a new season. I wanted to do that with Arcane before season 2 dropped, and eventually I was just like, I'll rewatch season 1 another time. I'm getting spoiled for season 2. I need to just bite the bullet and jump back into it.
No, it's so true, and I think what you're hitting on there is a really interesting thing. Of it can be so difficult to remember what happened in some of these things, because
Yeah.
under the binge model, you see much less of a focus on episodes and much more of a focus on moments, as is like very brilliantly discussed in Super Eye Patch Wolf's latest video on Riverdale. It's one of those things where like the desire to have these like big shocking moments that will like trend on social media for like 2 days and like get everyone talking about things often leaves it feeling like this very scattered series of memories. And just for the record, it doesn't seem like me and Charlie are ragging on these things too much.
I was gonna say, like, we should probably also have this disclaimer, like, we're not we're not railing against the serialized format at all. Like, we're gonna be discussing like the merits of that alongside, you know, what we think are some of the strengths of episodic structure.
No, 100%. And the thing is, like you were saying, Charlie, because like both of us are like in our late 20s, we were in this really interesting period where we started to see things transform. And in some cases, there are really interesting case studies like Adventure Time, which was a show that started off purely episodic, but ran for so long that it became a much more serialized thing, focusing on like kind of character arcs and linear development and all things like that. And it's honestly offered some really wonderful storytelling possibilities. It's just one of those things that whenever you see kind of a artistic or technological paradigm shift like this, you often see people running so quickly to be a part of the new big thing that they sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Well, yeah, it's very interesting how it's not always, or not just reflected in the stories that are being told as a result, but how those stories are being told.
Yeah, no, I think that's so true, and I think it is a case of certain kinds of stories. Like, for example, under the binge model, I think you see a huge prevalence of thrillers. Like, me and
Yeah.
Meg, we binged like the whole like first 2 seasons of that show You with Penn Badgley, because it does that thing Sarah Z criticized it for in her video on the problem with the binge model, where it's basically endlessly looping you in with a series of sort of false cliffhangers that will make you think, well, okay, let's watch the start of the next episode, find this out, it resolves itself. Yeah, it really does affect the substance of the stories being told.
Yeah.
I think this is a good kind of opportunity to get a little bit more into the specifics of why we think episodic storytelling can offer not only great opportunities to a viewer who is enjoying a new show or a new like series of anything, whether, like you said, Charlie, audio drama, like a series of short stories, fanfic, whatever. So, Charlie, what do you think is the kind of first point on our list of why people should give episodic storytelling a chance, even in our increasingly serialized world?
I think if we're gonna start out with anything, I think the first strength to mention is the level of accessibility that episodic storytelling can offer to a viewer, but not just to. And well, actually, I'm going to argue not just to a viewer, but to someone creating it too. And we'll get more into that as we go through. I think the freedom to be able to tune into a single episode of a show and get a full self-contained or largely self-contained story, start to finish, it's almost inviting you in. It's like, right, this is what you can expect week to week, as, if we're talking about shows that were broadcast to and syndicated to television, you can tune in and this is what you're getting. This is what you're getting week to week. You're getting this complete experience rather than parts of or drip-fed parts of a larger but yet still incomplete experience, especially if it's a show that is multiple seasons long.
No, it's so true. It's so true. And I think it offers a series of boons to both the show and an audience member. Because, Charlie, I know we have both had this experience at some point, and it crosses genres. Whether you're talking something that is like a sitcom, like Parks and Rec, or What We Do in the Shadows, or some of our favorites like Peep Show and The In-Betweeners, or you're talking about a kind of Monster of the Week show like Doctor Who, or The X-Files, or Buffy the Vampire Slayer, or you're talking about like a full-on anthology.
Oh yeah, big fan of anthologies here. Love Death and Robots, one of my favorites.
Yeah, no, it's true. All great shows. But what's great about these things, if you are a audience member or a member of a fandom or whatever you want to call it, you know your friends better than anyone else does, presumably. And if you want to get your friend into a show, you are going to know the exact episode that will have them hooked on this thing. But if you're looking at a purely serialized show, and you're giving that classic, like, painful, withering pitch of, I swear to God, it gets really good in season 3.
After season 8.
No, exactly. Whereas if you can say, hey, just drop in on this episode, free of context, it's your kind of thing, you have significantly more chance that the hooks are going to be in that person. And that obviously benefits you if you want to get more people into like watching the same shows as you, so you can enjoy it together. But it is amazing word of mouth marketing if you are the creator of one of these shows.
That's very Sigma Grindset of you, Henry. That's very it's very showrunner CEO of you.
This is some full on like Gary V, Tyler.
Oh no!
Here in my show, got some new episodes here. You can check them out in any order.
What I like more than a serialized story is these self-contained episodes here in my garage.
I hope people know what we're talking about and don't just think we've had some kind of mental breakdown in the middle of
Go watch here in my garage.wmv.
After this, of course. We need
after
to watch
this video.
But no, I think this is actually a really good opportunity, Charlie. In as much detail as you're comfortable giving, this accessibility thing, this idea of like dropping in as a writer, you've been developing your own show that a lot of us are all involved in, part of the burgeoning Warner network.
the Wanus audio cinematic universe. I'm just kidding. We're never doing interconnected stories. We're not hacks.
But yeah, tell us a little bit about how accessibility has kind of fed into that and made it a little bit easier to make from your point of view.
In terms of the project that I'm currently working on, it's definitely made it easier for that kind of accessibility has translated to allowing other writers to come and be a part of it as well, by focusing on the kind of core tenements of what the show is, what the core dynamics are, who the main characters are, what the kind of format and structure of each episode is. That has been so helpful in just getting other people to be like, to kind of understand the assignment and you know, to their credit, at present, like, the writers that, you know, have contributed episodes to the show, Henry, yourself and Meg included, have taken what is there in kind of the show Bible and the pilot and been able to translate that in, just gone off on their own and been able to translate that into, have gone off on their own and been able to translate that into phenomenal scripts that I could never have come up with in a million years. And I think that speaks to the strengths of having this kind of accessible episodic format. It's, you get the like I said, you get the assignment, you get what the show is from one story, and it opens the door for more people to contribute stories with those characters and as part of that show. You brought up What We Do in the Shadows as well, Henry. Like, another great example. Like, and a lot of sitcoms have this kind of that kind, because the episodic structure is so baked into a lot of them. Look at how many different writers have written for any of your favorite sitcoms, because you get these identifiable characters and you get these identifiable dynamics that can change and can evolve and can, you know, develop throughout the course of the show, but in an isolated start to finish piece of that story, or single story rather than, like I said, the piece of a larger story. It's so much, it's distilled. It's distilled, and you're getting to, you know, it's easier to tap into that from like as another writer coming in to you know, play in that sandbox.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, and that's definitely been my experience as a guest writer on this upcoming secret show. And if you're listening to this right now and thinking, oh, that sounds kind of appealing, I really like the idea of, like, creating a sandbox for my characters and my ideas and inviting in my friends or other writers to add to that world, then this video in particular, I think, is really going to be for you, and we're going to get more specifically into writing tips for this kind of storytelling later.
So stay tuned.
Hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and leave a comment.
We're doing
down
all
below
the calls to action,
telling us what your favorite soda is. I'm a Pepsi man myself.
Don't lie, Henry Galley. We all know what yours is, but the audience have to guess.
It's true. And if you guess wrong, I'll kill you. All right, so
he will. I've seen him do it.
This leads to the second strength dimension of episodic storytelling, which is having a stronger episode-by-episode experience, which we were kind of alluding to a little bit in the opening, but I think you have a much higher chance of having episodes that remain a part of the consciousness of the audience if those episodes are compelling, complete stories. Which brings us back to Doctor Who. Charlie, not to put too much pressure on you, but what would you say are some of your favorite Doctor Who episodes?
Oh, I think the strongest ones and the ones that stand out so well in not just my memory as like a longtime fan of that show, kind of ever since the revival era, with obviously show run by Russell T Davies, starring Christopher Eccleston as the Doctor, and then later David Tennant. That kind of like
classic New Who.
Classic New Who. It's like it's also such a great roadmap for doing an episodic series. You know, obviously everyone mentions Blink. Blink is, yes, a very, very, very good self-contained episode. Another one that springs to mind is Dalek, immediately, from season 1. 2-part story, I know, but the Rise of the Cybermen and the Age of Steel, always been a favourite of mine. Also, my favourite recurring legacy Doctor Who villain. Don't at me, Dalek fans.
They can't type. They've just got plungers and a... There are no Daleks in our comments.
The Chad body horror Cyberman versus the Virgin Dalek. Turn Left is another really good one. Turn Left, Midnight. If you'll allow me to, Henry, to tell a little bit of a personal anecdote about Turn Left. A little bit of Charlie Deep lore. So like I'm not gonna do the math on how old I was when those episodes first aired back in 2009, but I was still a kid. I was still very young, and there was like a next time on Doctor Who like preview clip of Turn Left, which for anyone who's unfamiliar is an entire episode that takes place in a parallel timeline wherein the Doctor wasn't there to save people, and like one of the companions, it focuses on the Catherine Tate's character, Donna Noble, his companion, and it's a kind of what if they never met. And one of the early scenes in that episode, it shows the Doctor's body being carried on a stretcher. It's covered, but being carried on a stretcher, and like his hand falls out from under the covering and drops the sonic screwdriver. And little Charlie loved David Tennant's 10th Doctor. Worshipped that character, worshipped that performance, wanted him to be on TV all the time. And in a way kind of got that, the claw curls on the monkey paw. But there was so much finality to that shot in that episode that in my brain it was as severe and as like devastating as the death of a loved one.
Which is like, I feel like there is a good chance that basically everyone watching this video right now has had that experience with a character in a piece of art that was really meaningful to them. And the thing is, all of those episodes you listed off are fantastic episodes, and I could list even more of my own, but strangely, despite being a writer who is often rightly criticized, I do think Stephen Moffat actually had one of the best things to say on this. I mean, not only did he write a sizable chunk of those episodes you just listed.
To bring a recent example of his, Boom from the most recent series of Doctor Who was a Stephen Moffat episode and was one of my favorites of the new Ncuti Gatwa led series. So Steve,
take that for what you will.
You're good at your self-contained stuff, but oh my god, you've made some errors.
Well, that's the thing. Again, I think a perfect example of, as H Bomber Guy said in his legendary Sherlock video, Stephen Moffat is a perfect example of someone who excels in episodic storytelling, but when he has the scope to go serialized, fucks it. Anyway, that aside, but something that he quite famously said about Doctor Who is, you've come up with a good episode of Doctor Who when you can say to yourself, damn, that's blown that feature film idea. And that, I think, is a legitimately fantastic way to approach this. And like I said earlier, it's the exact same whether you're talking anthology, comedy, mystery, sci-fi, action, hospital drama, like a million different things. If you can think of something that is like, hey, here is a really strong 3-act story that, in the case of a non-anthology work, the main characters of this can be involved in, and you don't even have that constraint if you're talking anthology, the result is going to be something that is a really, really memorable tale that sticks out to you. And the beauty is, in a really strong episodic show, the great episodes will stay great even if the show falls off.
Doctor Who is a prime example of that. I have revisited because every so often I'll get struck by crippling self-doubt in my own ability to, fairly analyze media, and be like, was I blinded by nostalgia last time I watched this? I better check again, and I'll rewatch sort of series 1 through 4, and then inevitably end up watching the the following seasons up to I think Capaldi's exit. But those 4 seasons that I mentioned earlier, the sort of the Eccleston and then the initial Tennant run, years later, nearly 2 decades later, for some of those stories, oh my god, the way that they hold up, the strength of the writing under each one is it makes them timeless. Like you were saying, Henry, like a show can continue on past that point, but and fall off, but the great stuff from earlier stays great because they are self-contained, isolated little story experiences.
And I think 2 perfect examples of the opposite here. I get that it can be really annoying to watch videos like this and see people make like bold statements about things should be like this, which, you know, we'll generally avoid, because at the end of the day, me and Charlie, we're just 2 people sharing our own subjective opinions on art. But when we do say something like this, we'll try to evidence it as best as possible with real examples. And 2 shows which were absolutely huge in their day were, as we kind of alluded to earlier, Game of Thrones and Lost. And the thing is, despite the reputations those 2 shows would later have, the early seasons have some absolutely incredible storytelling in them. Like Game of Thrones season 1 through 4 is some of the tightest political intrigue, fantasy world building, like complex morally grey characters. Same with Lost. It's a deeply like intriguing experimental show, the likes of which has like never been seen since. But all of them were so driving towards a specific conclusion. Game of Thrones, which was much more serialized to begin with, was always driving towards who's going to end up on the Iron Throne. And with Lost, it was always the big mysteries of how do the people end up on the island? Will they get off of it? And given that both shows, it is pretty widely agreed, fell off towards the end, you realize that the central question, the thrust that was driving everything forward, ended up being like a damp squib. The result is it saps a lot of the power from those early episodes, even though a lot of them are objectively very good, because it's like a lot of the time it feels like it's a strong setup to a bad punchline.
Yeah, it's posthumously robbing them of what was once good about them. You're gonna out myself here. It's one of the reasons why I've never watched Game of Thrones, because I know that it falls off at the end and people were unhappy with it and it was unsatisfying. I do think it's a shame that I've not had that media experience like of that great storytelling that happens early on, but it's like, you know, again, we're not railing against the serialized format, but I couldn't dip into a few episodes of one season and then jump to the good episodes of another season in a show like that. I'd be completely lost. I wouldn't know what was... I'd be completely lost.
And again, in a case of well-told stories, like I've been watching The Sopranos lately, which is every bit as fantastic as people say, it's always this kind of like rich tapestry of subplots that in a serialized story that manages to stick the landing can be an absolutely phenomenal experience. But you do, as we were kind of saying, safeguard your legacy a little bit more if there are these kind of episodes that are future-proofed. Because it doesn't matter whether, you know, again, Doctor Who is in a flop era or in a Slay era, it's not gonna make Blink any less scary or the Vincent van Gogh episode any less like emotionally impactful. And the same can be said of no matter how unsatisfying the myth arc of the X-Files might end up being, how long the show would go, how the characters would be replaced. It doesn't make episodes like Home or Tombs any less terrifying, doesn't make episodes like Humbug any less hilarious, doesn't make the time that you spend with these characters feel wasted, which, by the way, is, I think, a really interesting
That's a
segue
really good
to our
segue.
next strength.
That's a really good one. Bravo, Henry Galley. Everybody give him a clap in the comments.
Yes, please do. I need the validation.
Not the clap, you...
Please don't.
Go get tested.
So, yes, Charlie, what is our next point of discussion for the kind of benefits of episodic storytelling?
Well, you were talking about characters just then, and I think that, like you rightly pointed out, that is a great segue to talk about the greater potential for satisfying character development that could be had with episodic storytelling. Not to keep hopping back to this example, but I think it is, like I said, it is a great roadmap for an episodic series. Dalek, the episode of Doctor Who that I mentioned with Chris Ferguson, that is a phenomenal character study of the Ninth Doctor and a exploration of trauma and like survivor's guilt. You know, when he is confronted with, you know, believing himself to be the last of the Time Lords and the only survivor of the Time War, confronted with the, at the time, sole survivor of the Dalek race, the species partly responsible for wiping out his people and his home, and how he reacts to that. I think that's and this is the thing. That might sound like, oh, but you'd only know that if you'd watched the earlier episodes. All that information is told within that episode. There are hints of it in earlier episodes, sure. This is, you know, because it's part of the myth arc of that season, but a huge amount of that context is already present in that episode because it's relevant to the story being told, and it's relevant to the character arc and the character development that's happening, you know, with that character.
No, it's so true. And the thing is, I get that a lot of the people listening to this, especially our younger audience members who like became like cognizant of like media literacy and started analyzing stories when we were further into this kind of pivot to serialization, you might be thinking, well, how could an episodic thing lead to more developed characters? Because surely in a more linear serialized story, you're putting more building blocks on top of each other. And that can be very true. But in order to tell a satisfying, self-contained story in each episode, a character needs to go on a journey every episode, emotionally, narratively, mentally, rather than, as is often the case with serialized storytelling, just a chunk of a journey. And again, you might say, maybe strawmanning people here, well, surely that would just result in a character like speed running their arc. And it's like, no, what it forces you to do, as you were just discussing with Dalek, Charlie, is pick a facet of the character, a facet that will tie in to whatever's being done in the episode, and you can just spend a whole episode playing with that facet.
I like to think of it like, with an episodic story, you're almost getting waypoints. Like on a hiking trail, you're getting like, here's a point where we're going to stop and talk about this part of the character, and then we're going to go to the next one, and it might focus, and that next waypoint might focus on a different character, or a different facet of a different character, or a different facet of the previous character. You know, there are episodes. Again, I know I'm bringing this example up a lot, but it is a very good example of an episodic show. But like, there's examples in Doctor Who. In that first season, you go from Dalek, which is, you know, like I said, about the Ninth Doctor and his grief and his trauma, and then a couple episodes later, you're kind of doing the same thing, but with Rose and her, the death of her father, like the loss of her father at a young age, and how that's kind of affected her, and what she does to then, you know, try and amend that and change that, and then the consequences and the fallout from doing so. You know, it's here's where we're stopping to, like, this week, focusing on for this self-contained story.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And to draw on another example of something that I know is popular.
Yeah, I promise it's not going to all be Doctor Who.
Yeah, no. I mean, again, it is something where, this is what happens when you get the two Brits together. It ends up being all Doctor Who.
Yeah, it's one of our few remaining cultural exports at this point.
It's true. But no, to do another thing that people of this channel are very likely familiar with, Gravity Falls, a show that both me and Charlie really
absolutely.
love. A show
Gravity
that
Falls.
Literally every contributor to this channel loves. Ask Zooey, who is absolutely watching this right now, what they think
Hi,
of Gravity
Zoe.
Falls. I think the sheer force of the energy might disintegrate you like a laser beam. But if I was to cite a very random, very inconsequential seeming episode of Gravity Falls, one that in hindsight, even Alex Hirsch has said he wasn't very sure about, Dipper versus Manliness. That is the episode where Dipper meets a bunch of like hyper masculine centaurs.
No, the Manitors, Henry. Get it right.
Yes, sorry, the Manitors. And over the course of the episode, tries to like get inducted into their ways until in the end, Stan kind of sets him right and shows that it's more manly to be someone who is self-determining. And again, cute little episode, good message for the kids. But the thing is as well, that episode frames so much of the important characterization around Dipper that will come into play in the myth arc. He's someone who feels the need to be respected, feels the need to be treated like an adult, taken seriously. It informs so much of his relationship with Ford and informs so much of the kind of rift that begins to grow between him and Mabel in season 2 that Bill Cipher goes on to exploit. And this is a perfect example of, if Gravity Falls was just the serialized adventures of the Pines trying to defeat Bill Cipher with no diversions, you'd never have an episode like that would give that context for the character.
It would be because in a serialized story it would be seen as pulling the focus away from that central storyline. Whereas
it'd be seen as
here,
filler.
It's exactly. Whereas here it's in an episodic show that again it gets to breathe, it gets to have more focus, it gets to be dealt with in a far more complex and like complete way, rather than feeling like a side story to a larger arc.
No, it's true, and that's the thing. When you can take advantage of this, every episode is an opportunity for your characters to shine. And honestly, the beauty is, if you are making a show that has a large cast, this is very common for sitcoms, but you'll also see it in procedurals, whether you're talking criminal investigation, mystery, hospital, any like workplace sitcom. You can have what TV Tropes calls the Day in the Limelight episode. You can spend a whole episode just focusing on a character we don't see much of. I mean, The Simpsons is a show that obviously has gone downhill and might be seeing a bit of a redemption in its recent seasons. But the funny thing about that show is, despite being a very silly episodic comedy, Springfield and its residents feel like such a real town full of real people, because over the course of the show we have gotten to laser focus. Like, we've had episodes based around Fat Tony and snakes and Mayor Quimby and Dr. Hibbert and Bleeding Gums Murphy and Dr. Nick and Mr. Smithers
and Principal
and
Skinner.
Burns. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. The power of episodic storytelling is an episodic segment in an anthology episode of an episodic show. The Steamed Hams skit in a split episode can become the biggest meme in the world for like a year. And that is a scene that features none of the main cast. It features the school principal of the two kids of the family.
And the superintendent of the...
Yeah.
It's... Hey, Henry.
Yes?
What if I took writing advice on episodic storytelling from this video and passed it off in my own work? Delightfully devilish Charlie.
Localized entirely to this video. And that's the thing. You can have great character moments and dynamic scenes localized entirely in episodes without feeling the need to, really breadcrumb character development.
By comparison, in a serialized show, the more drawn out character arcs, not just character arcs, I think story arcs as well, can feel like the characters stay static for a lot longer, and like they're only developing kind of at a snail's pace more granularly. I hate to reference this show a second time in this video, but it's been 4 seasons and the boys still feel no closer to killing Homelander. And granted, they've gone through some changes, those characters, but ultimately they're still kind of the same as they were when we first met them.
But that's the thing. I think the boys suffers from a flaw that a lot of things do. A lot of serialized things, especially, in many ways it feels like the plot just becomes, how can we create more excuses for the thing that needs to happen not to happen?
Pretty much, though.
It's like, again, to take the boys as an example, it's, well, okay, what excuses can we make for Homelander to not track down and immediately laser all of the boys to death? Or what excuses can we make to not have the boys, put their heads together, agree that taking out this guy is for the greater good, and, get to doing that? It's one of those things that this is probably less an issue in things that are creator-owned, but if you are a show that becomes sort of a victim of its own success, and some studio executive over your shoulder saying, just maybe 1 or 2 more seasons.
Maybe we'll do 5 seasons when we originally said we'd do 4.
Which, by the way, massively also happened to Lost, as we were discussing earlier. They had a set ending in, I believe, either season 3 or season 5, but they were printing money over there. So they were just told to keep making it beyond that natural point.
Well, the same thing happened with Game of Thrones as well. They correct me if I'm wrong, but they kind of used up the material from the books that they were adapting to the point where they ended up kind of crossing over the threshold into we don't actually know what happens next in the books, so we kind of have to make it up.
No, it's true, which hilariously is the reason for so much of the anime filler that people complained about in the late 90s and early 2000s, because the production of the anime outpaced the manga, because much like George R.R. Martin writing those huge doorstopper Game of Thrones books, the manga was in many cases single creators with just a few assistants to help with kind of shading and backgrounds and things like that. And burnout is real. It's one of those things where, as much as I get the frustration of, Game of Thrones fans pressuring George R.R. Martin to write another book, it's do you have any idea how hard it is to write one fucking book?
Well, I don't, Henry, but someone we know does.
Yeah. But before we move on to some of the other planned talking points, I really do want to discuss this idea of the myth arc real quick, because
yes,
it's something that we've dropped a few times and is present in so many of the examples we've talked about. Like I said, Doctor Who has a myth arc, Gravity Falls has a myth arc, The X-Files, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, all of there's 1,000 more, but it is midnight, so you'll have to forgive me. But essentially, the myth arc is the serialized narrative weaved in amongst the more episodic entries. People who are fans of our extant shows, like Kingmaker, for example, the kind of myth arc of that show is both the political future of the VSR and the specific fate of the Kingmaker itself, the magic diamond that is in Colette's head. In Gravity Falls, it's figuring out the secrets with Ford and with Bill Cipher and culminating everything there. Doctor Who, there's a new one every season. The X-Files, it's the nature of what happened to Mulder's sister, the government's kind of relationship with aliens. Myth arcs can be a really mixed bag, because they can be an amazing part of the show. Like, I would say that any of the Bill Cipher episodes in Gravity Falls um, are as good as, if not stronger, than the episodic fare, just because those elements and the mystery around them and the character development that feeds into them is so good.
Mm-hmm.
The other side of the coin, the X-Files myth arc is famously not liked nearly as much as its standalone Monster of the Week episodes. Yeah, so I would say that a myth arc is neither a good nor a bad thing. Like,
Yeah.
if you're telling a sitcom, you probably won't need them. What will amount for your myth arc will likely just be plot threads, character relationships. Again, any plot points that kind of tick over between episodes in the background of what's happening.
It's Guillermo wanting to become a vampire from What We Do in the Shadows, or
Yes.
which of the friends end up marrying and or fucking each other. I forget.
No, exactly. That's a good example. Like, character relationships, in a workplace thing, like new guy at the office, big upcoming project, anything like that. In something that's like a mystery, like, it's the classic. The Sherlock Holmes original stories were all very episodic, but there were certain overarching villains like Professor Moriarty, who would like appear in multiple tales and kind of give the characters an equal. I would say my biggest tip for having a good myth arc is to not intertwine it too deeply with the episodic entries, which is something that the Moffat Sherlock series is pretty famously bad for.
And a lot of his episodes of Doctor Who as well.
No, it's true. Like, when he was the showrunner, he was very notorious for kind of like long, like rambly, overcomplicated, and prophetical,
like, myth arcs that just weren't very satisfying when you kind of got to their supposed conclusion. They just kind of felt like, and here's the next part of this ongoing thing.
It's a very delicate balancing act when you want to make an episodic show with a myth arc. I would say it's always better to have more episodic entries than myth arc entries, just so it, because otherwise it's gonna feel like a serialized show with filler rather than an episodic show which occasionally has kind of plot advancement episodes. Adventure Time, by the way, is another like really good example of this, where a lot of the time it will be like, oh, let's see what like the Lich is up to, or let's get a piece of like character backstory for like one of the main members of the cast. Yeah, I think most of all with a myth arc, it's making sure that it fits the story that you're telling and doesn't end up kind of eating it, if that makes sense. But no, and I think weirdly, to bring that full circle back to character, sometimes in a badly written serialized piece or in a badly written an overwrought myth arc, you lose a lot of character goodness because the characters start to feel like pawns of the plot rather than like active characters with agency.
Yeah, it robs them of some agency, yeah.
Like, whenever possible, you want to avoid your characters being reactive and have them be proactive. What do those buzzwords mean? So, a reactive character is when things happen to the character and they have to just react. They're buffeted along by the plot. In a lot of kind of mediocre horror movies, the main characters will be quite reactive.
Big time, yeah.
How would you describe, in a kind of very user-friendly way, Charlie, what a proactive character is?
A proactive character is simply, or quite simply put, someone whose actions contribute to driving the plot forward. Like, they are not the center of the universe, they are not the person, they don't even have to be the person who is part of the inciting incident that sets the plot in motion, but they are someone who, by engaging with other characters or engaging with the events of the story, they are that's having the effect of continuing the story.
Yes, and I would also add that if you're wondering how you can have a character do more of that, I think the simplest way is put them in situations that give them difficult choices and have the choices reveal things about them.
Yeah, we need to be learning more about them. That's just a good tip for character writing in general. Like, your character's actions need to say something about who they are as a person. What so sucks is when a character acts away because the plot needs them to, because, oh, well, we've got to get to the next part of the story, so they have to do this, otherwise we can't get there. That's so much less interesting.
Which, again, late season Game of Thrones, when it was just a case of, okay, we need to kill most of these characters, the rest we need to get here, it very much felt like characterization was taking a step backwards.
Most recent series of The Boys, Billy Butcher has to fuck up and kill Victoria Newman and, disband the team so that, to stop them from having a way of, like, securing victory at the end of that season.
It's true, and it is that kind of the money's in the chase mentality, but sometimes the extent of the chase beggars belief. But it isn't just character, it's also, I would say, the next kind of strength dimension is you can have a much more specific focus on themes and ideas. Don't click off. Click off. I can see you going for the
You stay where you are. You stay sat down, all right?
We have snipers trained on you from all the
I am
legends.
in your walls.
But the thing is, themes and ideas do not have to be this kind of like highfalutin, like namby-pamby thing that is like only for like high art. Like, even the most kind of like well-made, like popcorn fodder, grindhouse material will have themes and ideas. Like, I think the best way I've ever heard themes expressed is, what is your story really about?
Mm-hmm.
You know? Like, it's one of those things where it's like, to take a movie that you and I both love and has been discussed on the channel before, The Lighthouse is a story about two guys going insane on a lighthouse. But what it is really about, in addition to a bevy of bizarre psychosexual themes, is two different kinds of toxically masculine men engaging in a dance of mutual destruction because of their inability to get over their bullshit.
Yeah, while also with some, like you mentioned, some real weird horny shit mixed in.
It's true, and we love some real weird horny shit mixed into everything we make. That being said, you can have a very specific focus on having an episode explore a single idea. Like, again, funnily enough, weird link, we were talking about Dipper versus manliness in that episode. That is literally about him exploring what masculinity means to him
during like a formative part of his childhood as well, which is like even more like thematically and contextually relevant there, because it's like, yeah, he is young, like adolescent, approaching like being a teenager, and it's demystifying a lot of like the stereotypes and tropes associated with the nebulous concept of masculinity. Yes, the non-binary in the room said that masculinity is nebulous. Die mad about it.
It's true. Another great example, I think, to discuss, a whole show of basically this, was The Twilight Zone, which is, I think, maybe the ultimate of the anthology TV shows, definitely the most iconic, still today one of the most beloved, and every single episode of that show not only told a very tight and specific focus story, it also explored a theme, and it was able to explore that, like, a specific theme to such an extent, whether you're talking about Cold War paranoia and xenophobia in The Monsters That Do on Maple Street, whether you're talking about the kind of horrors of nuclear war in Time Enough at Last, whether you are talking about, like, humanity's place in, like, the wider ecosystem and the fact that we, at the end of the day, are all animals, like, to serve man, or the like discussing existentialist themes, like 5 Characters in Search of an Exit, Like, it allowed for such a specific focus that Rod Serling was able to, at the start and end of each episode, basically say, hey, this is what this episode is about. Let's explore it. And it didn't feel a lot of the time kind of cheesy or didactic. It felt like, okay, we're getting in here. This is treating this seriously. Another like classic show from this era is Star Trek, both the original and later ones like the Next Generation and even modern iterations, so heavily episodic, and every episode generally so incredibly like philosophical and thoughtful and intelligent. And it's strange, you see that a lot with kind of like 60s TV. They really set the tone for this idea that like television didn't just have to be cheap thrills, it could be about high-minded ideas.
And I think it's worth having that discussion either internally or with a collaborator or whoever about if you're going into an episodic story or a story as part of an episodic show, it's worth having that discussion up top. Like, what do you really want to tell the story about? What do you really want to discuss? And then thinking about how, like, what's the most natural way to explore that with the characters that are, whoever the leads of the show are, or whoever, like, the recurring cast are. Or if you're doing an anthology of, like, right, if that's the story we're telling, who's the main character of it, and how are, not only their actions gonna, inform and have an effect on this story, but how is that also going to speak to this theme?
Yeah, exactly. And I would say my kind of last piece of advice on making theme less scary as a writer is don't torture yourself by thinking in terms of what's an interesting idea, what's something that people will think I'm like thoughtful or intelligent or whatever.
Yeah, don't try and win points with people by like picking it's not about picking the most big brain theme and big brain idea that you want to discuss. I think the best themes and the best thematic messaging or through lines for stories come from very personal places.
Yeah, and that's hit the nail on the head, Charlie. It's all about asking yourself, well, okay, what do I believe? Because any storytelling, no matter what, it is always going to feel shallow and inauthentic if you're exploring ideas that aren't personally meaningful to you. If you are someone who is conscientious, who has thoughts about the world, who has criticisms of the world, of culture, of the way things are done, of systems, of individuals' behavior, then you're already halfway there. It's just about developing the introspective eye to identify the themes in your own life and then abstract them, which is to say, apply them to more out there stories.
And you brought up an excellent example of this, Henry, like before we started recording. And I'm not gonna like steal this from you. I would like you to tell the audience, like, but you brought up a very, very interesting example from, of all things, Recess. I know all the people our age just feel like they got punched back in time, and I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, they're all here and they're like, like,
no one should remember this.
No, Recess was actually a really good show, and as much as we brought up more prestigious things throughout this video, a lot of our love and appreciation for episodic storytelling was born in like cartoons and like CBBC shows and stuff that we watched when we were kids. And I think Recess is a really great example. And if you're looking even younger, things like Arthur, which explore different ideas. But anyway, to go to the specific thing Charlie was hinting at, there is an episode of Recess where TJ, the main character, who is kind of the cool, chill guy that everyone likes, finds out that there's someone at school who doesn't like him. And because TJ has invested so much of his sense of self in being the guy that everyone loves, he spends the episode trying to convince this guy to like him. And it turns out the guy just doesn't like him for no real good reason. Their vibes just don't click. And no matter what TJ does, it doesn't shift the guy's opinion. He doesn't like him. doesn't want to be his friend. And the episode is not fundamentally about TJ realizing, well, here's what I do, here's how I make him like me. It is about TJ coming to terms with the fact that you can't make everyone like you. And I think,
Yeah.
if you're someone who, like we have, like many people have the kinds of, like, social anxiety where you don't want to be on bad terms with anyone, you don't want anyone to dislike you, it's a really hard thing to cope with, knowing that at times. And this episode gets to fully explore that, like, what I'd describe as just incredibly niche social situation in a way I've never seen done. And I think that's what's kind of beautiful about these episodic things.
And I think it speaks to your point from that you were making, Henry, and that's why I brought that example up, is because that is such a personal story. That is, this is pure speculation on my part, but you could believe that is, almost not one-to-one, but, told from the perspective of someone who has had that as a lived experience, or knows someone who has, or has maybe had a kid who has had that experience. Like, that speaks to what we were saying before, like, about when you're trying to, determine what the theme of this episode is, you just got to look inwards.
And honestly, the beauty of it is, if you are telling a multiple episodic thing, you don't need to go huge with it. It doesn't need to be like. And in this episode, we talk about how we would bring peace to the Middle East, or like in this episode, we talk about, like, what the characters believe is the correct position to have on the death penalty or euthanasia or something like that.
Oh boy!
Like, no,
can I bring up an example of a show that really, like, tried to do that, and it was rough.
I'm morbidly curious.
The show Arrow, which I am gonna confess to having I didn't finish it, but I watched a lot of it because back in the day I was a cape shit enjoyer. I know, I'm ashamed of it myself.
You pathetic soup-worshipping cunt. We're allowed to say that, by the way. We're British. Anyway.
Yeah, we're allowed. Anyway, they had a kind of quite tone deaf, and very, like, very centrist kind of pilled episode on gun control that was, not handled with the most grace, I'll put it like that, especially because, we're talking about protagonists most of whom actively kill people, just using, one of them just uses a bow and arrow instead of a gun.
Some real we need to talk about Kevin shit. Yeah, I think the sub advice of that would be, perhaps don't bite off more than you could chew, when it comes to, like, for example, like, you're very unlikely to see, like, me and Charlie being like, hey, here's an episode of one of our shows we've written, it's about the black experience.
Yeah, see, we're both far too mayo for that.
Yeah, and like, it did ditto for, like, pulling an Alex Garland and being like, here is a thing about, like, the plight of women experiencing sexism. Well, we're not going to tell anyone what they should and shouldn't be writing stories about. But at the end of the day, because that isn't mine and Charlie's lived experience, all we're going to be doing really is reheating things we've read elsewhere. We can't bring anything new to that table.
Exactly. And I think part of being, both a good writer and just being a well-rounded person in general, really, is being able to acknowledge that you cannot know the lived experience of someone that's not you. That's not to say that everything you write has to be indicative of your worldview, or has to be, all your characters have to be stand-ins for yourself.
Nor should they be.
Nor should they be. And, like, there is a degree of, like we were saying before, of abstracting. But I think, like you say, like, when it comes to dealing with sort of tackling big ideas, it's perhaps best to understand that your own experience will have given you strengths, but also limitations in certain ways. Is that a fair thing to say, Henry?
No, I think that's 100% fair, and it leads really nicely to our kind of final cluster of ideas of this video, which is specific tips based on our experience. Because the thing is, we've written a lot of episodic shit at this point. Less is more, an incredibly heavily
Massively
episodic show. We've both guest written episodes of the Kingmaker Histories, Meg's show, which is another great example of a largely episodic show with a myth arc. And not to mention the frankly ridiculous amount of like NDA'd ghostwriting work we've done that is all episodic, self-contained.
Has to be by decree
of above. But again, it does show that ultimately we're not completely just chatting shit here. So but building off of Charlie's excellent last point there, yes, it is completely true that your lived experience will give you things that you can write about like few other people can, and will also give you blind spots. But the beauty of writing episodic things, as we were alluding to earlier in the video, it is much, much, much easier to bring in guest writers to do episodes. And if you've made your writing room diverse, you can tell stories about basically anything, because the collective lived experience of the writers that you bring in will far surpass your own. And it's not even like the writers you bring in will need to read all of the other episodes. They'll maybe need to read one episode and the show Bible. Do you, real quick, Charlie, want to just explain what a show Bible is, just for people who don't know, because you wrote one quite recently?
I did. So a show Bible is a document that gives a overview of central ideas of a show, or the central characters, list of influences. You can detail sort of the characters and specific relationships that are important to the show. Mine also contains a season plan for the first season of Secret Show, with open slots for certain other writers and We Are Not Alive contributors to write for. And some already have. It's for internal use, but it's for introducing people that are going to be working on the project to the premise, the characters, the world, core, basically whatever the core details someone would need to know in order to contribute to a show or contribute to a project. That's what a show Bible is, and that's what it's for.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and that's pulled out an old classic. Sure, we'll get some comments about me saying, yeah, no, absolutely
yes,
again.
No, absolutely.
Congratulations, guys. You made me self-conscious about that. Anyway.
That is the famous Henry Galley catchphrase, and I will hear no slander against it.
All of my many verbal tics that have been brutally categorized in comment sections throughout the channel's history. But
hey, my catchphrase is still yet to make it into a video, so
It's true. I mean, we'd have to censor it. It's pretty profane. But with Meg's permission, we'll include Kingmaker Show Bible, a link to it in the description, so people can see what one looks like with a show that they can go and listen to right now, to give you a very tangible and real example of literally exactly what we were just talking about. For those who aren't familiar with the Kingmaker histories, which you should be, you fool, we've all written for it, and it's great that there was literally just an episode with Gianni Matrograno in it. Like, that's high culture.
$6 shrimp special himself. It's my favorite video of his.
So, one of the three main characters of the show, Eisenhower, is an Indian man living in Europe in the early 1910s. And as you've probably gathered by now, neither me, Charlie, nor Meg are Indian. So, while, other aspects of Eisen are things that we've all written in our various episodes of the show, those kind of facets of, like, his identity haven't been things that we've been able to explore with such a great depth. But having gotten now multiple South Asian writers really wonderful folks, some of whose episodes are already out, to write for the show, it's unlocked facets of Eisen and his experience that we wouldn't have been aware. And it's the exact same when it comes to getting writers who have different disabilities, different genders, sexualities, races, ages, like basically any sort of vector for identity that you can imagine, especially ones that are already relevant to the characters that you've got. These are all things that guest writers can explore, and at the end of the day, is going to be fundamentally easier in episodic storytelling, where guest writers are simply allowed to leave more of their individual thumbprint on the episodes that they write.
And in addition to that, I'd also add that purely because we're all human beings with limited brain capacity, you are not going to be able to think up every episode premise for your episodic show on your own. You need other people around. You know, again, without giving specifics, the scripts written by both Henry and Meg are two premises for the show that I'm working on that I would never have thought up in a million years. And they're currently my two favorite episodes of that show.
And the thing is, the reason that is that, like, obviously there is diversity of identity in all of the ways that we've just discussed, but there's diversity of thought. Everyone that you bring in has likely read books you haven't read, seen movies you haven't seen, watched TV shows you haven't watched. You are, like, had experiences that you haven't had. And this will come together in them having entirely different reference pools from which they draw ideas. And the beauty is, with every new writer you bring into the writing room, you are expanding the reference pool in a way that makes the whole thing feel a lot more textured and developed, as Charlie said, in a way that a writer working alone simply couldn't do.
Exactly. Think of how much of an amalgamation of experiences, of things you've seen, done, things about who you are. Think about how much of that is you as an individual. Now remember that everyone that you work with and that you work alongside is also one of those, but a completely different one. And then imagine what kind of amalgamation your show and your project can be when you bring those people together.
100%. And this kind of brings us on to our last two big tips for writing this kind of thing. So one of them is to have a strong, repeatable format that is specific but flexible. And I have a fun example here.
Yes.
Take medical dramas like House or Grey's Anatomy, for example. Both of those are like procedural hospital shows of different types. So it's specific in that okay, these episodes will all be in like clinical settings, like hospitals. We'll be dealing with sick people and the kind of politics and struggles of having these jobs. Neither of those shows would be nearly as flexible or effective if, like, let's say all of the cast of Grey's Anatomy exclusively worked in, like, the ear, nose, and throat unit. You know? Like, the like, cases that they would deal with would get samey.
It's all tinnitus. It's all tinnitus, baby.
It's the like, 10th episode they've done on strep throat. And it's starting to just get gross at this time. And that's a great example of the balance. Like, you want something that is specific and
the balance
identifiable.
Must be respected.
Like, exactly. Like, for example, to return to an old chestnut we've discussed a great deal through this video, Doctor Who. You can reliably say that's a great broad premise. Anywhere in space or time, the Doctor can show up and, like, solve something. But what you're not going to get is the Doctor and their companion, like, solving, like, a series of, like, completely non-anomalous murders in, like, modern-day London.
Yeah,
because
exactly.
that would be outside the purview of the format.
The idea of a format can sound very restrictive. It can sound like something that you have to stick to religiously, and I'd say not quite. I would best describe it as something that has specificity but not rigidity. It can be flexible, it can give you room to, tell your stories in new and interesting ways that isn't just cut, paste, template, paint by numbers, repeating the same beats per episode just with the specifics changed, but instead you're there's a familiarity to how these stories are told, there's a familiarity to the characters and to the way they interact with these stories, but it doesn't have to be something that boxes you in as a writer.
Yeah, no, 100%. Don't worry too much about whether your format is original.
Originality is dead, baby doll.
Yeah, but yeah, let's take Monster of the Week and just list off the shows there. Like, off the top of my head, we've got Doctor Who, The X-Files, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Supernatural, Torchwood, Astrid and Lily Save the World, Goosebumps. All of those things I just described, for the most part, are immensely popular shows. Like, no one has ever looked at a show and thought, oh god, another Monster of the Week, because it's a tried and true format, and the monsters and the characters and the specifics of the setting and the methodology where you'll set yourself apart.
Each time you watch a new Monster of the Week show, you never know what you're going to get episode to episode, because it will be unique to that show.
Exactly.
And not to give too much away, but a certain show we might be working on might be following the Monster of the Week format. I don't know. Who could say? Not me as the showrunner. I don't know what's going on.
No, it's true. There may be a Monster of the Week show being added to the one constellation of shows that you'll be seeing in the hopefully not too distant future. But again, like, the blank of the week is tried and true. Kingmaker, for the most part, is a kind of like crime of the week thing, which it shares with shows like Leverage, which is also a big influence on the show. Like, it's things where it's like, at the end of the day, you just need to be able to tell a compelling type of story. Mystery of the week / case of the week. At the end of the day, as long as the specifics are unique to the story you want to tell, no one is going to be like, wait, they drive around and solve mysteries? That's a Scooby-Doo / Supernatural ripoff. Because at the end of the day, there are going to be people who are always hungry for stories like that. Yeah. This is a little, like, kind of sideways piece of advice for this, but I've learned never deny a comparison. Because if you explain someone the concept of your thing, and they say, that's kind of like that thing I like, your response should be, yeah, it's exactly like that thing you like. You should check it out.
It's a great way to bring people into what you're doing. Like I said before, specificity, but not rigidity.
100%. And I think this leads on to the very last point of the video, which is, going a little bit deeper into those specific things. You're going to want characters who, at a glance, satisfy kind of broad and quickly identifiable archetypes with clear dynamics between them that you can, pick up as you get into the show. Like Supernatural, for example. Sam is the more kind of like silly, fun, audience insert one. He says what the crowd is more likely to be thinking because he's less immersed in all of the demon bullshit, whereas Dean is the like serious, intense bad boy. Same for the classic Mulder and Scully dynamic. One is the skeptic, one is the true believer. To take Gravity Falls, another one we've discussed throughout this video, Dipper is like high-strung, serious, intellectual. Mabel is like fun-loving, joy-seeking. You're very sort of like typical like lovable boy crazy teenage girl, and Grunkle Stan is a kind of like sleazy con man with a heart of gold.
And if I can cite an example from my favorite sitcom of all time, One Foot in the Grave. Victor Meldrew is a loudmouthed, very angry man in his retirement age, and Margaret is his very serious, long-suffering wife to this set-upon man.
By the way, we're definitely not telling you here to make your characters broad, to not give them kind of like hidden depths, because as we've discussed, there are brilliant ways to do that in episodic storytelling, but you have to. One of the things you need to do when you are telling an episodic series is every single episode, the onus is on you to ensure that the audience can get their bearings as quickly as possible with the assumption that this is the first episode they're seeing. You want to give them a strong vibe and a strong hook.
Exactly. The quickest way to do that is through characters that are that strong and that archetypal. It's bringing an audience up to speed. It's putting them on the same page so that they are on board with what's going on as quick as possible.
Exactly. And one of the best ways to do this in practical terms is, like we were saying earlier, give your characters a choice early on in every single episode, a choice, a scene, a line of dialogue that perfectly illustrates what they're all about. Think of it as every episode we meet them again, and here are the essentials. And over the course of the episode, the deeper layers can be built in. All things considered, that is the long and short of the power of episodic storytelling, and why, despite a lot of changes in technology and culture and audience expectations, I honestly think we're primed to see a return to this kind of storytelling, and if you get on the boat now, you can be ahead of the curve.
Return to episodic, return to Monkey.
Exactly, and I guess to finish things off, we would love to hear two things down in the comments.
Yes.
Number one, what your favorite episodic show is, and number two, what episode you would recommend anyone who you'd want to check out that show to check out first. Pitch us, sell us,
and sell each other. Sell your fellow We Are Not Alive commenters. Get a little discussion going down there.
Exactly. We love to see it, and we love to, I guess, just get people enthusiastic about either the art they're consuming or the art they're making, because at the end of the day, that is the lifeblood of this big creative ecosystem that we're all members of.
Remember, format, repeatable, specific, but not rigid. Strong, archetypal characters. Get the audience on the same page as you as quickly as possible. And collaborate. Bring as much new perspective and different ideas to the table to keep each episode distinct and fresh.
Couldn't have said it better myself, and now I can't believe that I'm going to get to say this. This has been We Are Not Alive, and we'll be seeing you again in the near future.